Next, from the Union League Club of Chicago, Senators John Cullerton and Sen Radogno and Representative Jim Durkin review progress made in the spring legislative session. The legislative leaders also discuss their top reform priorities, as well as their thoughts on redistricting, a graduated income tax, and term limits for those in leadership positions. This runs about 50 minutes.
Okay, are we ready? Here's a question that myself and colleagues and peers came up with. The Illinois for Campaign for Political Reform ensures that we're a bipartisan organization. And you might think making politics and government work more effectively for the people of Illinois would be something that both parties could support. But sometimes that doesn't seem to be the case. For example, Democrats complain that recent efforts to reform redistricting are actually Republican ploys to claw their way back into power, and Republicans, on the other hand, sometimes complain that voting reforms, such as same-day registration, are merely efforts to get more Democrats to the polls. Quit looking at me like that. I'm not saying you're saying that. No. Why can't the two parties agree on what seem to the rest of us like pretty common sense reforms? Is reform itself just another partisan issue? And Mr. Newby, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sue. You're great. Anyway, thank you. This is a great honor to be here, and I appreciate the committee to allow me to say a few words on a very important issue, just overall reform in state government. But before we talk about the things that we disagree on, I think it's important to know that since I've been in November, we've agreed on more than we've disagreed. And I will just say, I just want to start off by saying that my relationship with my friends to the right and also the Speaker, it's been very good. And if any of you have kind of watched the proceedings over the last 6 months, I will say that the tenor of the debate in the House of Representatives has been more measured, it's been respectful, and that's something that I've emphasized greatly with my caucus, is that we are there for a short amount of time. We are in the people's chamber, but we also have many people who come great distances to sit in the gallery to watch us debate bills, whether it's in the House of Representatives or in our committee rooms. But in this year, people talk about the lack of cooperation, but I think that that's a misnomer. I mean, it was just a short amount of time ago where the four of us met, Speaker, President Cullerton, Leader Radogno, to take on the largest issue facing the state of Illinois. That's our public pension systems. And all four of us worked collaboratively together last December, to pass a bill which was important for the state of Illinois. Everybody has complaints with the bill, with some part of it, but the fact is, I believe that was a great start for us to be able to use that as a foundation on the most important issues of the day, where we can put the partisan issues aside. We did it shortly after that as well with the Chicago pension reform. And I will say that, there was an issue that came up. We had a lot of referendum issues that came up this session. There's two of them which are citizen initiatives, but there are other ones which are advisory referendums, and they are what they are. But there was an important one that I feel that was raised that's going to be on the ballot. It is a voter discrimination question, which the Speaker championed, and I went up to him shortly after he had introduced it, and I said that myself and my colleagues in the House of Representatives believe that no one should be denied the ability to vote based on their demographics, and I went on as a co-sponsor. I'm not sure, going back years and years, of whether or not that would have been a similar type of action, but I will say the civility in the chambers is good. I think it's better for most people who I've talked to, but we are going to have partisan differences on certain issues moving forward. I'm not sure if that was responsive to your question, Susan, but I wanted to at least lay a foundation of how things are operating in the chamber that I'm serving as minority leader.
No, thank you very much.
Susan, can I respond? First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me, and I'd like to thank you for voting for me for President of the Senate back in 2009.
And can I just say there were other people to vote for?
Yes, I know. That's right. It was a contested election. Thank you.
It was.
Well, I just want to follow up on what Jim Durkin said. We are not anywhere close to the dysfunctionality that's going on in Washington, D.C. We have a much more cooperative spirit, I think, in the General Assembly, and we have accomplished a lot as a result of those working together. And specifically, to address the issues of reform, go back to 2009 when Senator Radogno and I both got elected to our jobs the same day. We had the Lehman Brothers had just collapsed a couple months before. Our governor had been arrested. The House had impeached him. And we had to start working together even before we were sworn in to work on an impeachment trial. And the first thing we did after that trial was to start, at the request of the governor, set up a blue ribbon committee, take testimony, and came up with reforms dealing with procurement, Freedom of Information Act, and campaign finance limits for the first time in the state. And they were true improvements. We increased disclosure of contributions. We had year-round reporting of large contributions. We had quarterly rather than semi-annual reporting, increased electronic reporting, and had auditing, allowed auditing of political committees. So these were bipartisan efforts. We, 10 weeks after that, passed a huge jobs capital bill that no other state in the nation had ever taken on. So there's been a couple of areas where things have been more partisan, but I certainly understand that. That's generally in the area of the budget. But as Jim said, the major issues on workers' comp and school reform and McCormick Place changes, pension reform, Medicaid reform, all of these have done with cooperation. So you may not have read it anywhere in any newspapers, but we did it, and they were accomplishments.
Well, let me ask if there's anybody here from the Tribune editorial board. I hope you're listening. Christine?
Well, thank you. I'm not going to disagree with a single thing that either Representative Durkin or Senate President Cullerton said, but that kind of brings us back to the point, if everything's so hunky-dory and we're so bipartisan, why is everyone here frustrated and feeling like we really don't have good, robust, bipartisan discussions and good policy coming out of that? And I do believe that that is the case. Sure, on minor things or those problems that clobber us over the head, like pensions, and we're forced to have that discussion, we do. But why is it that there's not a more cooperative spirit, that there's so much emphasis on power? And to me, that screams that the single most important reform that we could do in this state is one that we have not done yet, and that is changing the mapping process. And that is not only in the state of Illinois, but quite frankly, other states are tilted in the other direction. You know, we're Democrat here, others have tilted very Republican, and then that speaks to extreme congressional districts that I think feed into the loggerheads that we see in Washington, D.C. I think that with technology being as good as it is now, map making under the systems that many states have in place it's such a science now that bulletproof districts are drawn, and that is impeding us. So ideally, I think at the federal level, we ought to have a discussion about how maps are drawn, because it also affects congressional races and consequently federal government. Barring that, of course, we've had a great discussion here in the state about changing our mapping process. Will we ever get to one that's absolutely perfect and non-political? Probably not. Can we do a better job than what we have now? Absolutely. And I think to the extent that you have competitive districts, that you will get that robust discussion on both sides. You will see legislators not having to run for cover to the extremes in both parties, and as a consequence, we'll have much, much better policy. I was speaking with someone earlier. As you know, we do have the potential of the Fair Map Amendment on the ballot. It's a citizens' initiative. The signatures have been challenged. I'm told there's a rehabilitation effort going on right now, and it's doing very well. I know Representative Durkin and I sent a letter to the State Board of Elections asking them to please grant the extension to allow that process to fully play out and the rehabilitation of as many signatures as possible to occur. I would encourage everyone in this room, including my colleague Senate President Cullerton, to encourage the State Board to take their time so that that initiative can get on the ballot.
Well, thank you for that. And the invitation that we sent out said that we were going to ask these three leaders to talk about their legislative reform priorities. So that is the question of the day, and if we could start with Leader Durkin, if you could lead the charge on that.
Thank you. And just to follow up on Chris, and I'll get into that, I will be voting for both the citizen initiatives next November. And Chris and I both are pleading with the State Board of Elections to give the citizens the right to rehabilitate questionable signatures. I think it's very important that citizens have a voice in this next November. But I came back. I left the legislature in 2002. I lost the U.S. Senate race in probably one of the more forgettable years of the Republican Party. And I'm glad unfortunately, I'm the only person that doesn't forget about it, so I keep bringing it up. But I came back into Springfield, and sure enough, the first thing I did is I ran the impeachment committee in the House. I was I was the ranking member in the impeachment committee. All of us were involved, and it was the right thing to do. But more importantly, something that just recently happened about 48 hours ago across the street, and that was one of our colleagues in the House was convicted by a federal jury, and I was a co-manager with one of my colleagues on the removal, something that hasn't been done, of that individual about a year and a half ago. But the whole issue of how we handle grants and member initiative projects is something which has been very, very vexing, challenging, but it's gotten people more in trouble than not over the years. A few years ago, and I post-Blagojevich, I introduced bills that would require the line item listing of any type of member initiative project, as we otherwise known, aka pork barrel spending, that's going to go into any type of capital expenditure bill. I think that is extremely important because we find out after the fact, because things move so quickly down in Springfield where we get little time to review these bills, that there is some very well-intentioned state investments in projects, but then there are these just massive amount of dollars, significant millions and millions of dollars that are going to different entities that, whether it's questionable of their legal existence, but ones that really I think are not deserving of state investments. And I also put a bill in that would stop the lump sum appropriation of these types of bills too. Sadly enough, both those bills didn't get out of the Rules Committee. But I do think when we talk about member initiatives, pork barrel spending, grants, which the gentleman across the street was removed from the House of Representatives for the second time, one by us, but also by the federal court. We really need to dig into that. It's a reoccurring theme of how people in the legislature and also people outside get into trouble. I think it's responsible for us to do a better job in appropriating money, but particularly when we have these massive capital spending bills, and even within our budgets, even in this year's budget, there's pork barrel spending. It's one of the many reasons which I voted against the budget. But I'll tell you one thing that we did this past session. Now, that to me are my priorities. There's one last. I'll get into that in a few seconds. We passed a transportation bill. It was a capital spending bill strictly for roads. It was presented to us as that this is a $1.6 billion roads program. And I looked at it, about $1.1 billion of it was going to go strictly to shovel-ready projects that the Illinois Department of Transportation already had in the queue. But there's another $500 million, $500 million that I looked at it was could be considered discretionary, that I didn't think was appropriate considering we were coming off the worst winter of all time. So I'm pleased to say after I received the request from the governor, I said, will you support this $1.6 billion spending? I said, I will not support $1.6 billion. I will support $1.1 billion of dedicated monies that are going to go strictly to the worst roads that the Department of Transportation has identified over the past few months. So I'm pleased to say that I'll give myself a pat on the back, but the first time we've had one of those types of bills didn't have all this type of pork barrel spending in it. So it was a good bill, it was a good process, and I'm thankful my colleagues to the right supported me, and as did the Speaker. The last issue that I think is really important, and I put a constitutional amendment in earlier this year, is to basically eliminate lame duck sessions. We know what happened 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, in the lame duck session in January. There was a tax increase imposed, the death penalty was eliminated, civil unions was passed. We became smoke-free Illinois. All are worthy subjects to be debated during a regular course of a session. However, in that legislative session, we had no accountability on so many members. We had a legislator who was brought in to serve only for 72 hours, who was there to vote the party line. And I think that we are increasingly becoming more reliant upon lame duck sessions based on how elections turn out 2 months before that really goes against what the building's about. So I had a constitutional amendment that would move up the swearing in through the second week of December, and that would require any action between any legislative action between the date of election until that second week of December would require a proclamation that would be signed by need to be signed by 4 leaders, which would explain the specifics of what exactly we are going to address during this time period. And I think that's important. And let me just be perfectly clear. While I've been in the minority for so many years, a Republican Party back in the day is responsible as well. Both sides have blood on their hands with the abuses that have come with the lame duck session. And I would hope that we would, at some point, realize that this is not the best way to govern. I will continue, and oddly enough, my constitutional amendment never made it out of the Rules Committee, never received a hearing, but the fact is, we are going to be talking more about it as a caucus, and I know that Chris Radogno did this a few weeks ago, that we need to get away from these last-minute controversial or very, very heated issues, or ones that wouldn't pass, or maybe during a regular session. I remember that 3 or 4 years ago, some of the guys turned their phones off in their legislative offices. There was no lease left. They weren't even serving in an office. But these are the people that were either retiring or people who lost in November elections, and basically there was no accountability with their constituents on these issues. They couldn't find them. So I think that that is another reason why we need to do more, or we need to look at this whole issue of lame duck session, and what I've said has been traditional and historical abuse by both parties.
Great. Okay. President Cullerton, you can refute or add your own priorities.
Sure. Thank you, Susan. I wanted to talk about the status of campaign finance, the way I see it. And, you know, I talked about the reforms that we passed back in 2009 for the first time ever to have caps on campaign contributions. And then the Citizens United case came right after that and really dramatically changed the landscape. We now have a huge problem with super PACs, which have unlimited amounts of money, and yet, as Paul Ryan said, the definition of coordination is very vague. So these entities are able to, in effect, act as if they are coordinating when they're not supposed to be. And I had this happen to me. The only election I lost was 20 years ago when I ran for Congress against Dan Rostenkowski. He had all of these huge lobbyists that supported him. I was the challenger. He was under investigation, and yet he was able to get all these people to, quote, you know, in an uncoordinated way, spend a lot of money. He was also endorsed by the Chicago Tribune editorial board that year. The same chairman, by the way. Not that it's bothered me. Obviously, I've just forgotten about it. But so now that's a problem. At least those super PACs, though, have to at least disclose where they got the money. But this dark money that's coming in under this loophole, under the federal tax code, the 501c4s, these are politically active nonprofit committees. Groups like Crossroads CPS, which is Karl Rove, and Americans for Prosperity is the Koch brothers. They can raise money, unlimited, and they don't have to disclose where they got the money from, as long as 50% of it is spent on social welfare programs, which could include get out the vote efforts. And that, to me, is really what is devastating for any reform effort. So disclosure is, at a minimum, the most important thing. Many people here, and I agree as well, if we can cap the amount of contributions, that's fine. I'd be happy to, and have been, operating under those laws. But when your political opponents can just go out in an unlimited way, raise so much money, and not have to even tell us where they got the money, that's wrong. And so to the extent that the Supreme Court or Congress can change that, I think that's the most important reform we can possibly have.
Thank you, John. Thanks. And then Christine Radogno.
Well, I think I've already indicated my top reform priority would be the remap process. And again, I don't limit that just to Illinois. I think it's a problem across the country. Another thing that I'd like to talk briefly about, because I've been very slow to come to this, is the concept of term limits. That is something, you know, that looks like we'll have an opportunity to vote on. In my view, unfortunately, unfortunately, it's rather a blunt instrument as opposed to a scalpel to change the mix of people who are making decisions. On the other hand, we haven't been terrifically successful here in this state without term limits. I think we see models around the country where states with them have had some successes. In that regard, I'm open to looking at that as long as those limits are long enough for people to acquire a good working knowledge and have an opportunity to implement some of their priorities. I absolutely agree with the Senate President on the disclosure issue. I did help pass the campaign contributions. I know we have them at the federal level. I do not think that system is working well at all. I know for a fact that larger organizations now who used to contribute a big lump sum are now doing it through their subcontractors. I mean, it's just constantly how do you get around them? And that's a problem. So I think that the focus on disclosure is where it needs to be. But at the end of the day, I think that no matter what we talk about, there is absolutely no substitute for something we really don't have control over, and that is an educated and involved electorate. You know, we have got to be sure that people understand, you know, the purpose of public schools was to make good citizens, and I think that we have had such a great ride in this country that we have lost sight of the fact that what's at stake here when citizens watch a 30-second commercial and make a decision based on that. And so I don't know what efforts can be made with regard to civic involvement and encouraging that. Certainly, I'm preaching to the choir with this group, but we all need to think long and hard about how do we get well-educated, informed, thoughtful voters to the polls.
Great, thank you. Good round of responses. Thank you so much. We all hear that Illinois has several layers of government. Some people would say unnecessary layers of government. Is there anything that the three of you would like to comment on regarding reforming, removing some of these layers, combining some of these different agencies and organizations, and to cut our costs down, to reduce our property taxes, and save some money?
Susan, I'd be happy to start with that. I get this question all the time, and being from Chicago, most legislators from Chicago are all in favor of reforms in this area because we do not have township government. We have one school district, and those are the big areas where the rest of the state has such controversy. There's a bunch of legislators have come up through township government or they've worked on school boards. When you get into the consolidation efforts, especially in school districts, because they have debt, it's very complicated in an effort to try to consolidate school districts when one has more debt than the other. Townships have assets. It should theoretically be easier to do that. But the politics have been brutal. And I've introduced legislation. Even as the Senate President, you can't I don't order people how to vote. And when you talk about people outside the city, they have conflicting interests. So I agree. It doesn't directly affect the state's finances as much, but it's the taxpayers in those property taxpayers in those counties and townships in school districts where they're paying for extra layers of government. So it's really a political issue, but I don't disagree at all with the efforts to try to consolidate.
I think, John, you're absolutely correct. I look at my tax bill, and holy mackerel, anybody live in the suburbs, you just look at the long list of different taxing bodies. I mean, you have no idea how much it took us to get rid of the TB district off a few years back. But the fact is they had lobbyists, they had people who were working against it. It took almost 3 years to get that done. But one thing that I think I find really interesting and fascinating is these coterminous townships that encompass municipalities in Cook County. I won't mention them by name because I know some of the people there. But the fact is you have a town and you've got all these different agencies within the town that are doing all kinds of services, and then you have the township government, which is exactly the same boundaries, and you've got all sorts of other layers within that. And just look on the west suburbs. So to me, easy, low-hanging fruit is the elimination of these coterminous township governments that are also serving, that are within the exact same lines or municipal lines, boundaries as the municipalities. I can understand at some point that you have unincorporated areas, and it's more so outside in the collar counties than you have in Cook County, that there needs to be at least some type of services provided. But But to me, one thing that I just find amazing, whether it's in Oak Park or Berwyn or Cicero, I just see no need for those types of governments who have, that they serve really little or no purpose. But the whole issue of eliminating these governments, just look what it took us 3 years ago just to get rid of this TB district. It was not easy to do, but I hope that moving forward, we've got more local governments than anybody in the whole world. And I don't know how we continue to go down that path without trying to do a greater job with consolidation. I know at DuPage County, we passed a bill a couple years ago that I think will start that process, but it's got to be done on a statewide basis. And I agree with the President of the Senate that we need to consolidate, and some of these governments just need to be eliminated by allowing for, I think, more reasonable and efficient ways for referendums to be passed for voters to be able to eliminate some of these governments that functions can be absorbed by another area in government.
Yeah, I mean, I think they've said a lot of what needs to be said. It is a difficult thing to do. I do want to especially call out Dan Cronin, the president of the DuPage County Board, who has undertaken this effort. And it's not just well-known entities of government like the townships, but there are lighting districts, there are fire protection districts that exist only on paper, and the only people that get paid are the people that shuffle the paper. I mean, there is still some low-hanging fruit out there, but it's legally complex. And I think that we, the General Assembly, and with bipartisan support, have encouraged those kinds of efforts to take place. But beyond just the cost, the property tax cost, you know, when I spoke a moment ago about informed voters, I think this is a real impediment to getting people to the polls, because they look at their tax bills, they couldn't possibly be on top of every unit of local government, plus state government, plus paying attention to what's happening in Washington, not to even mention the morass we have with judges. So we want voters to be informed, but then we make it almost impossible for them to do it. So I think that the two problems dovetail off one another.
Thank you. I also want to do a shout out to the Honorable Abner Mikva, who is over there. Thank you very much for coming. He's served in all three branches of government. Thank you so much. So we're now taking questions from the audience. We have received a couple, so I'm going to read the first one. Could the panelists explain how district mapping reform would lessen the effect on money in politics? It's a different approach. So, Jim, you're first.
Well, it's real easy. The way the system works right now, the victor gets the spoils, and they get the pen, and they decide, you know, to the extent they can, they have to be consistent with population shifts. But I'll just give you an example. I was down in Danville, Illinois, a month and a half ago. One of my colleagues had a fundraiser right on the Indiana border, and then I ran into the congressman who represents that area. His name is John Shimkus. He lives in Collinsville, which is on the Mississippi, but his district goes from the Mississippi all the way to the Indiana line, and that wasn't just by chance. But the fact is, and I will say that again, I want to make perfectly clear, the Republicans did the same thing. And I just don't think at this stage in our life where there is more public awareness about what goes on in Washington and Springfield, that the whole notion of to the victor go the spoils on the reapportionment process. You know, maybe there's a day at a point where the Republicans will have control, and then, oops, Jim, remember what you said back in 2014? But I think that there is a better way of going about it, and I think it's a fair way of doing it. But clearly, the maps are drawn in the way to ensure that one party will have the best chances of staying in the majority based on the way that districts were created. And I think most people don't even realize this. The legislature are the ones that create and draw the congressional maps as well. So to me, again, I don't think, maybe that's not right, but the fact is, it's clear as a nose on my face about what, how this process works. It's, and I just think that there's a better way of doing it. That's why I will be supporting, why I've submitted a letter with Senator Radogno to the State Board of Elections to allow for further time to have those signatures carried, but I will be supporting the Fair Map Amendment.
President Cullerton.
Yes, Susan, Jim reminded me that back after the 1990 census, when the Republicans did the redistricting, it was probably an oversight, but they, my house was actually 500 feet away from the district that I had represented for 12 years. So we had an opportunity to move, with our 5 kids, and my wife was very happy about
Good
that.
decision.
And so
Good remapping process.
the worst example of redistricting that I can think of was the one that occurred when we had 19 congressmen, and Denny Hastert and Bill Lipinski called a meeting, and they invited 18 of them to a meeting because we were losing a congressional district, and they all drew their own districts. And it was bipartisan. It included Mark Kirk and Bobby Rush. And Mark Kirk drew a nice district for himself. Bobby Rush put the guy who had run against him in a primary 2 blocks out of his district. That was Barack Obama. Lane Evans drew a district that was by far the goofiest looking district aside from Voting Rights Act boundaries in the nation. And we voted for it, both of us, because our congressman asked us to do so. And it was a terrible congressional district redistricting. I got to tell you that this last redistricting, which was challenged, of course, and upheld by Republican judges, was a tremendous improvement over that. The districts that we now have, the 18 districts, and don't forget, you have to keep in mind what the Voting Rights Act allows for in case law. You have to give minorities an opportunity to be in districts, even though they might look kind of strange, to have a majority of a voting age population be a minority. The districts that we have are, I think 6 or 7 of them are very competitive. And you'll find that in this election that's taking place this year. Mark Kirk himself, when he ran for the U.S. Senate in 2010, if you superimpose his election results in 2010 over the current map, he won 2/3 of those districts. He won 12 out of the 18 districts. So it is difficult to try to draw districts where you want competition, because some parts of our state are really overwhelmingly Republican or overwhelmingly Democrat. But you'll find that there are, I think 7 out of the 18 are very, very competitive. And that's what I think we should have in Congress. We should have congressmen who are there where they have to at least think about what the other side of the aisle is interested in.
To go back to the question regarding how the remapping may affect money in politics, I'm not sure it would lessen it, because frankly, when you have competitive races, that's where the money goes to get the message out. So I guess the question is, do we want to spend money on politics, and then how do we account for that? You know, I'm a believer in disclosure. I'm not a fan of public financing. I just think that we can't afford what we have now. I don't know how we would afford and determine who gets that public money. But I do think disclosure would be important. I think having competitive races would not necessarily reduce the amount of money spent, but then I hardly think we can ask television stations and newspapers and radios and printers to give us their products for free. I mean, we have to recognize as citizens that if we want to engage in this democracy, you know, there are some basic costs to it. It's not, you know, we can't just do it with no investment whatsoever of money or, again, voters' time, which I always go back to. I think that's so critical and clear.
Okay, I'm going to start a new chapter on different types of questions. This one is, what happened with the graduated income tax vote? What are its chances of coming to a vote at some moment in time?
I recall it failed.
Okay. Any more comment than that? Or do you want to?
Well, you know, I think that there will continue to be discussion about tax policy in general, and there should be. I think that there were some concerns about that there wasn't really much assurance, because of the way our Constitution is structured, what the rate structure would be if, in fact, the public gave the General Assembly the right to set the rate structure. How do they know that it wouldn't end up being something they were opposed to? So that's a problem. But we should always be thinking about, you know, how our taxes are structured and whether we have the right structure. I will say, I think that that discussion, again, would be best had when there's balance between the parties. I don't see any major changes in the tax structure unless and until we have a balance in the state.
Yeah, Susan, we did not vote on that in the Senate. I would support it, but as Senator Radogno said, the real key is if you eliminate the flat tax, the question is what are the tax rates going to be? And there was wild speculation about misrepresentation about what people's views were on that, which kind of distorted the argument about whether or not there should be a flat tax or not. So obviously it's not on the ballot this year. It requires a constitutional amendment, so it'll be a couple years before it can be taken up again.
I guess the timing of it was just kind of difficult too. We, on our side, we think about job creation, job growth, and how do we encourage good businesses, and how do we keep families here in Illinois, but we have out-migration in Illinois, which is, it's spinning out of control. I mean, it just, and a lot of it look as what they believe in. It's not just businesses, it's families that are looking about what's in it for their kids down the road, and they see, you know, debt, and I think the attitude of that we're going to find a way to bring more revenues in as opposed to reforms to solve our problems is not something which was received by our caucus well.
Speaking of, there's a question here regarding the fact that many businesses and citizens-voters are leaving the state of Illinois. Would you like to comment on that as factual, or is that something that is just being bandied about?
I don't think it's factual. I believe unfortunately, it's been very politicized. There's a number of companies that are coming into Illinois, specifically Chicago. There's various parts of the state that are having trouble, but various parts of the state are doing very well. It's because we have an educated workforce, we have great transportation system, and as a result, our workers in Illinois make 22% more in salaries than all the states that surround us, even though our tax rate, our income tax rate at 5% flat is lower than all of the states around us, including Indiana. So this Illinois bashing has really, I mean, okay, it's politics, but it's really unfortunate because some people might actually believe it, and it's not true. There's a general migration of people my age from the north moving to the southern, more warmer climates, but there's not this big effort to leave Illinois for other states. It just isn't true, and I think it's part of the political season, and hopefully it'll end. We have engaged, like all states, in efforts to try to encourage companies to come here. We've given, let's face it, we've given tax breaks just as other places have as well, but we've also made some major reforms, like workers' comp, as we talked about, to try to respond to the concerns of the business community so we can grow jobs. We have a little bit better than average record since 2007 in creation of jobs in the nation. It's only been this last month when the United States has as many jobs as they had in 2007. And so I just think we have a much more positive story to tell, and hopefully in this election season, maybe that'll come up.
Yeah, I don't disagree with we should not be Illinois bashing. We do have a great state. However, the facts are the facts, and we do have an out-migration problem, and that is documented by the IRS, by the moving companies, by our own University of Illinois, who recently studied the census data and concluded that not only are older people leaving, but what is to me the most alarming fact is we're seeing the age group of the under 10s and the 30 to 45s going down. Those are families. And the conclusion in the U of I study, and I encourage you to look at it yourself, people are leaving Illinois for job opportunities. While we may have had some growth here, we simply are not as robust as those around us, and I believe that's because of some of the policies that we have implemented in this state. It is true we've tried to do some things, but clearly we're not doing enough and not doing it well enough in order to forestall what I believe, again, is the scariest possible trend. And I challenge everyone in this room to think about being at a family barbecue or a picnic or going out to dinner with your friends and people saying, I never imagined I'd live anywhere else, but I'm thinking about it, or my kids are thinking about leaving. That's a huge problem.
Thank you. This reminds me of being in the Senate, listening to the debate on important issues. So we're getting, some great information here. What are your opinions of consolidating more school districts? Obviously save money.
I absolutely think we should be doing it, and quite honestly, I know it's politically difficult, that's been discussed, but, in the suburbs where I come from, the feeder high schools have 6, 7, or the main high schools have 6, 7 feeder districts. Very difficult for me to understand how that duplicative administration and lack of articulation with curriculum serves our students well. I think we should be more aggressive in trying to encourage consolidation. It's a little trickier downstate when you have huge distances that have to be managed, and then there's other factors, of course, that cut across the state, and that is loyalty to your school, and that's a source of community life and so on. But at the end of the day, this is not an efficient system.
Anybody else?
Sure, I agree with Chris. I think it's probably more complicated than school funding, but school funding does, the whole issue of the school aid formula is something that we've been trying to tackle, and I know the Senate made a run at it this year, and the House didn't take it up, but it is probably more vexing when you think about how you're going to do this and how it plays in with state funds and how they go back to the individual schools. But also, whenever you talk about consolidation, you're also talking about bargaining units that you have to manage, and how are you going to be able to resolve the issues of the collective bargaining rights that these individuals within schools have. So it's a problem that's been around for a long time. I'm not quite sure if we're there to be able to make any substantive changes on it, but I think the concept is obviously something that should not go away, and we need to further immerse ourselves in.
Yeah, Susan, we did talk about earlier, but it is difficult politically, but I think that the best chance would be to tie it to money, whether it's capital improvements, not spend money on new schools unless those school districts agree to some consolidation, and perhaps even in the way the formula is addressed might be the incentive that we would need for school districts.
Okay, I've got one more hardball question, then I've got a soft question, then you guys can sort of sum up how you really feel. So the hardball question is, how do you feel about term limits on leaders, such as yourselves? Go ahead.
Well,
you're new.
I'll be happy to start.
Okay.
We had last inauguration in the Senate. There's 59 of us. There were 16 freshmen. The average senator that day we were sworn in had served for 6 years and 4 months. There's tremendous turnover in the Illinois General Assembly. The senators that I know from states that have term limits have told me the only good thing about it was that that's how they got in, but then once they got in, they realized that they didn't have enough time to understand their job. Lobbyists pick out freshmen to make them be the next speaker the next year. So generally speaking, I'm obviously not a fan. I think we have a great combination in the Illinois Senate of people who have got institutional memory like Senator Radogno and myself, Senator Severson, and Trotter, and then we have all these great ideas that come from the 16 freshmen. In term limits for leaders, we have elections. It's not easy to get elected leader. It's very humbling, as a matter of fact, to ask your colleagues, your equals, to vote for you. And they're every 2 years. And if we weren't doing our job, we wouldn't be reelected. So that's why I really think it's misguided. I know that it's very popular. We're not very popular. So the idea of term limits for everybody is probably very popular, but I just don't agree with it.
The issue, I think the question was term limits for leaders. And it's funny we ask it in Illinois because it's all really directed at one leader, which he is a national phenomena. None of us have been here an inordinately long amount of time. Emil Jones wasn't leader an inordinately long amount of time. Pate Phillips wasn't. So actually, well, both minority, I'm going to get to that, minority and majority. Oh, it felt that way. Is that what you're saying? But, I do think that it is reasonable. I do think that particularly, there needs to be a distinction between being a minority and majority leader. If you're a majority leader, there is a great deal more power and ability to, one, you set the agenda, you tell people what is going to be called, what is not going to be called. So if we had them, and I would not be opposed to them, I would say that if a party goes from the minority into the majority, that there should be a reset of the time. But I think the real potential danger is getting into another situation that we have uniquely here, where we have someone that has served as a majority, in the majority as leader for over 30 years, and the ability to amass and manipulate power is, I think, indisputably not a healthy thing.
So ultimately, it comes back to the House of Representatives. I think that's what you're referring to, Chris. I could read between the lines.
Delicate.
I've been on the job for 6 months, but the fact is, I said earlier, I'll be voting in favor of the term limits for legislators next November, but I also believe there should be limits on not only the Speaker, but also the House Minority Leader. There should be no inalienable right to those positions, and I think that in time, you know the dynamics that would go down within these caucuses, but I think new faces, fresh ideas is the right way to go in those chambers. So I would support a cap, a limit upon those serving in the position of Speaker and also House Minority Leader.
Great, thank you. The last question before you are able to sum up your thoughts today. We have about 20 students in the room who are interested in going into political science, running for office, public policy, becoming attorneys. Do you have any advice for them?
Don't become an attorney.
Well, we need more lawyers. So that's a good thing. That's something that...
Don't go to law school.
I hope that those young people would think about public service. We in the General Assembly realize, as I said earlier, we're not very popular these days, but we know who we are and what we do. We work with great, hardworking people on both sides of the aisle. I am very honored to serve with the people that we serve with, and we make really tough decisions, and it's in an era when the way people get their news is in such a way that we're not put in a favorable light very often. But we know what we do. It's critical. I mean, public service and government is about the most important thing that you can do, and so I hope that those young people feel like a public service career is something they could aspire to.
I think it's important that, I'm just going off my experience. I started knocking on doors for a township committeeman's race back in the late 1980s, and then I ran for school board shortly after that. And I gradually just built my way up within the organization and also my region, and that's how I became a state representative. So a lot of people come into Springfield or run for office. It's their first run for office, and they've got grand ideas and everything. But the fact is, I think it's important that you connect with your district. That you connect, if you've decided that this is where you're going to live, this is where you're going to want to raise a family, but you also want to become involved. The credibility that you build up by working your way up, whether it's no matter what party you're with. I think that's extremely important because it's going to give you that type of foundation for you to have credibility with individuals when you either want to run for a higher office, whether it's for Congress or for state rep. I ran for the Junior College Board many years ago because the Junior College Board had awarded themselves American Express Gold Cards, and that was the reason that I was Triton College in late 1980s. So I got elected, first order of business, I eliminated the gold cards. So I realized at that point that if you work hard and that if you're determined and you get elected to office, you can do some good things. And I will say that for all the negative that you hear about what goes on in Springfield, all of us do have an opportunity to do things that are going to have a profound impact upon individuals' lives. And I argue that we do more in Springfield that will affect your day-to-day lives than our friends in Washington. And I see many great things that we do on an annual basis that don't make the press. They're small issues, very, whether it's a little girl who had her cupcake, the cupcake signing the thing the other day. People, I mean, we can help people. We can make their lives different. But we've made a profound impact upon that young girl, but also many other people, whether it comes to issues regarding health care and every other issue we deal with. So I think that despite the negatives that come out of there, there's such great opportunity for people to do good things that are going to have a positive and a long and meaningful impact upon people's lives.
Well, I think it's great that we have people who are early in their careers thinking about public service. A couple of things I would advise them is, one, you don't necessarily need to be a lawyer to be in public service. And in fact, we need some diversity of background to bring to the table. So, consider all different kinds of careers. And then if I had any advice to give, it would be to think for yourself. And if you believe in something, don't back down. I mean, you might find out that you can actually convince people to your way of thinking. Now, it is true, sometimes you have to know when to fold them, but most importantly, know when to hold them.
Great. We're, I think, to the point where if you could comment on anything you would like to regarding Illinois politics, government reform, political reform, whatever, you have a couple minutes each, and then we will adjourn.
Let me just start and just say again, thank you for this opportunity. I've enjoyed my position over the last 6 months, and I will continue to say that. It's been a pleasure to work with the legislative leaders. And we've done more things over the last 6 months than I've seen in a collective manner on important issues than we've done in the past. But let me just say that this is an election cycle that, look, I'm partisan, I'm Republican, but the fact is elections have consequences. So to the 20 young kids who are out here, to young students who are out here today, when or if you have the ability to vote, take your time to study the candidates. Make a good decision based on what you think that person stands for, what their background is, and what they've done with their careers. The value of voting in November is that you don't have to vote for all Republicans or all Democrats. You're going to vote for the best candidate. So, but I believe that we've got a very good, this next generation of voters and kids in high school, and I've got kids, they're really in tune more with what's going on in government, and it's an absolute, it's a great pleasure, and it's a breath of fresh air. Because I will tell you, when I was at the age of 19, the last thing I had on my mind, nor my priority, was how I was going to vote in an election. I had other interests when I was in college, but I will tell you, kids are more engaged, and I think it's great, and a lot of it's through the electronic media and what's going on and how we're messaging. But I'm pleased that we do have young voters who are more engaged and are going to make informed decisions. But I can't stress enough about being informed.
Thank you very much, Susan, for inviting me. You do a great job with your organization. I've enjoyed being here. Jim reminded me, since it is an election year, we didn't talk about it specifically, but there are some new laws that we've passed to encourage people to vote. And we find that in elections that are where there's not a presidential candidate, there's usually a fall-off. That's something which we should all, whether Democrat or Republican, should try to address and try to make it easier for people to exercise their right to vote. Hopefully these laws will help, and hopefully we'll have more people participating in the process this year. And once again, thank you for inviting me.
Well, also thank you. This has been great. It's always nice to talk to a well-informed audience. Serving is a wonderful opportunity, and I agree with things that have been said about the great potential of Illinois. I just do not want to see us squander it. And we are at such a critical crossroads right now that everyone needs to be paying close attention as we head into this election cycle. I, too, want to see as many people as possible exercise their right to vote, but I hope, for the sake of the state, that they're informed voters and people who aren't doing it just because someone told them to do it in hopes that they're going to get something. That won't help us. We need to educate voters, encourage the informed ones to get to the polls, and choose a direction for our state, and I hope it's the right one.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks to our panelists.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.
Your participation.